We are time to get started. So, first of all, thank you everybody for coming along. My name is Johnny Winter. I'm here to talk to you about gathering requirements for your star schema. If this isn't the talk you're here to see, feel free to leave now, but hopefully you're all here to hear me talk about a subject that is very dear to my heart. So, a little bit about me first. I work as a consultant for advancing analytics. We're a consultancy that specialises in big data, data engineering and data science. We're one of the sponsors of the event. Please do feel free to come by our booth. We're right by the entrance. We have absolutely awesome swag. You should definitely come and see us. A little bit of housekeeping. Originally this was slated to be a talk that myself and Terry McCann were going to present. It's just going to be me today. Terry's here to cheer me on if anyone wants an autograph later.
Oh, good Johnny!
Thank you very much. So, yeah, I work for Advancing Analytics as a consultant. In my spare time, I also run the website Grayscale Analytics. A lot of people think that is a company. It's not. It's just a hobby. I don't make any money from it. I blog about Power BI. I've got a YouTube channel there as well. Feel free to go check that out. And I'm also one of the co-presenters for the Manchester Power BI user group. I've mentioned Power BI quite a lot there. Just to reassure people, this isn't a Power BI specific talk. It is tech agnostic and quite conceptual. So I've worked in data for over 15 years now. And that was a completely accidental career for me. I was studying politics and philosophy at university. I dropped out. I became a barman. And then a few years later, I found myself working in a finance office, picked up Excel, and everything snowballed from there. Got myself into BI. Anyone use Crystal Reports? Anyone remember that? Wow, anyone still use Crystal Reports? Good. So that was my background. From there, I got into more of the back-end development and doing data warehousing, using the kind of classic Microsoft SQL stack. Obviously, the industry's moved forward, and we've moved into cloud technologies, so use things like Data Factory and Databricks as well. So a full breadth in terms of the technologies that I've used there. And these are some of the places that the career's taken me. So that experience, as well as having a sort of breadth of experience across various technologies, I've also worked across various industries. So did a long stint working for BAE Systems, quite a big global defence company. If you're based in the UK, you may have heard of AO.com, second biggest online electrical retailer in the UK. And then my last few years has been working in consultancy jobs. So I've got a dodgy clicker. Feedback. This is my first time speaking at SQL Bits, which is a bit of a bucket list moment for me. If you have any feedback regarding the session, be that praise, be that constructive criticism, it would be much appreciated, both from my perspective, from a personal development perspective, but also so that SQL Bits can make sure they're maintaining a high standard of speakers. I believe there's also an incentive that the more feedback that gets collected, the more donations are going to the local food banks as well. So even more good reason to make sure you get that feedback in. And I'll be flashing that slide up again at the end of the presentation as well. So, why are we here? Here to talk about collaboratively designing star schemas. Now, for the technologies that we use, we still believe that the star schema is the best way to model data. The problem we can sometimes face, though, is that it becomes a disconnect between the technical team that are actually going to do that implementation and build that star schema, do the development work, and then the business users, who they're going to be the end users. They might be self-service analysts, they might be business users using self-service models. They are the people that need to get the benefit, and you sometimes get a bit of a disconnect. So in my time, I've worked with some really, really good developers. People who, they can write optimized SQL. They understand how to effectively partition a data lake. They, get excited about writing the best possible DAX, all these kind of things. But sometimes getting a little bit bogged down in all that technology, you might miss the point. On the other hand, I've worked with some really, really fantastic business users. These are the people who, they are relying on the analysis they can do from a data platform to drive decisions within the business. They're at the coal face. They're the people who are working day to day in the business, making the decisions. And as I say, work with some really, really talented people in that space, but they're not necessarily particularly technical, and sometimes they struggle to get across what they need from a data platform in terms of the requirements. So that can lead to a lot of frustration and a lot of tension between those two groups of people, right? It can lead to some to and fro, back and forth in terms of having to rework requirements. You know, your first iteration doesn't do what the business users need. You've got to go back, do it all again. That's all costing you time. If it's costing you time, it's costing you money. You know, it ends up with this horrible, like, vicious cycle of having to carry on doing iterations. Now, in a worst case scenario, potentially those business users just don't even bother using the data platform. They just sort of, you know, they're more than happy downloading a CSV from the ERP, noodling it about in Excel, and all that investment and time and effort you've put into your data platform doesn't get used. So we want to try and fix that problem. We want to try and bring those two groups of people together, make sure that they've got a common understanding of what needs to be delivered, and ultimately make sure that as a development team, you can provide a data platform that pleases your users, gives them the results and the answers that they need, and hopefully turns you into a data modeling superhero. So I thought the first question that I would address as part of this is whether or not star schema is still relevant. So if you go on the internet, there are all sorts of people who basically sort of say, nah, star schema's old hat. You don't want to be doing that anymore. So death to star schema, it's not needed. Learn from Silicon Valley's data engineers. Dimensional modeling is dead. Death of the star schema. Why star schema is set up for failure. Now, if you look under the covers of a lot of these articles, there's quite often some vendor who's pushing some tech that doesn't work well with star schema. So there tends to be a bit of an ulterior motive. The flip side of that, I believe, and the people I work with absolutely believe, that, yeah, there is a place for star schema. So again, putting on my Power BI hat, it's almost Power BI 101 that, like, the number one best practice is you want to be using a star schema. But it's not just Power BI world. This is a blog from Databricks. They're talking again about the fact that using dimensional modeling in Databricks and the Lakehouse is absolutely a valid modeling choice as well. This is a recent Microsoft blog about doing Synapse dedicated pools and best modeling practices. And if you scroll down that article, star schema is the recommended practice. And then this chap, who's a Microsoft employee as well, does a lot of blogging about data mesh and also Databricks and Lakehouse architecture. He talks here about the fact that if you're talking about medallion architecture in a Lakehouse scenario, that for that gold layer, he recommends actually absolutely using a Kimball-style star schema. Now, the purpose of today's talk isn't really to go into detail about what a star schema is. There's kind of, I guess, an assumption on my part that if you come along to the talk about how to effectively gather requirements for star schema, you've got a basic understanding of what a star schema is. But if it's something that you do want to go deeper on, absolutely the Data Warehouse Toolkit by Kimball is pretty much the definitive text. It's 30-odd years old, at least it's pushing 30, if not 30 years old, and is my go-to a lot of the time in terms of, you know, understanding those fundamentals. And then just a little bit more recent than that, Star Schema by Chris Adamson, also another great reference book if you've not checked that out. So, top level of star schema, we're talking two types of table. We're talking fact tables to capture the numbers that you're going to want to aggregate and analyze, and then we're talking dimension tables, which is the descriptive data that's going to let you slice and dice your data by. So I've alluded to already this idea that there are different personas that might be involved in a tech implementation. The developers, the technical people, they, as I say, the people that get excited about the tech nitty-gritty. Who in the room, just as a quick show of hands, would describe themselves being someone that does the technical implementation, someone who's a developer? Okay, cool. So for anyone that's watching online, that is the majority of the room. 100% for a conference like SQL Bits, that's what I would expect. It tends to be a conference for technical people to come along and further their learning. As I say, sometimes they can just miss the business context. They, absolutely can, talk all day about optimization techniques and that kind of thing, and, love writing code, but they're just a little bit removed from that everyday business. Now, the business users, on the other hand, understand the business, and they tend to know what they want from a data platform. It's not that they don't know what they want. They don't necessarily have the right vocabulary to be able to explain that well to a development team. Out of interest, and for the sake of balance, I guess, anybody in the room who described himself more as a business user as opposed to the technical developer? Okay, got 2 or 3 still. So what we want to do, as mentioned already, is we want to bring those 2 groups of people together. Make sure that we've got a common understanding in terms of what's going to get implemented for our star schema. And to do that, we have a requirements gathering technique that we've been developing at Advancing Analytics. And that technique, I'm going to get a better clicker next year. We call Sunbeam. Now, Sunbeam is a process for gathering requirements that I personally have been working on for at least 6 years now. And it's something that has evolved over time, and it's something that still continues to evolve and continues to be tweaked. As an example, it didn't even have a name until a few months ago. It was just a requirements gathering process that I had. And we've now dubbed it Sunbeam. And that sounds quite grandiose. Here I am, stood on a stage at SQL Bits talking about a requirements gathering technique that I've developed. Maybe that should be a tagline on LinkedIn, creator of Sunbeam. But the truth is that I'm really sort of standing on the shoulder of giants. And actually all this really is about is taking the work of other people in the field already, cherry picking a few bits and mashing it all together to develop this process. And those 2 techniques are Beam and Sun modeling. So again, if you haven't noticed already, I like to try and keep things a little bit interactive. So quick show of hands, anyone heard of Beam? Okay, cool. So again, for the people online, that was, I would say, maybe a third of the room. Okay, who's heard of Sun modeling? Okay, cool. Who's seen me do a talk on this before? And who'd heard of it before they'd seen me do a talk on this before? Well, blimey, down to 1 person. It was Terry. There we go. Okay, yeah, that's expected. Beam, out there talking to other data professionals, fair few people know Beam. Some modeling a little bit more niche. So to give you some overview of these 2 techniques. Ooh. Beam is a technique which is credited to Lawrence Core, who wrote this book, the Agile Data Warehouse Design. Beam itself stands for Business Event Analysis and Modeling. Can't believe I had to check my notes. I've given this talk 3 times already. Business Event Analysis and Modeling. And me as a data professional, in my career, when I first came across this terminology, it was a bit of a pivotal moment for me, because like I said, I'd read Kimball, and Kimball talks quite a lot about modeling business process. And this kind of flipped it a little bit. It was like, actually, it's all about events. It's not about a process and trying to gather information about a process. It's about an event that happens. And at that point in time when the event happens, let's gather all the information we need about that event. And then over time, we can aggregate all of those so that we can do our analysis. So thinking about things as events rather than the processes, personally for me, was like quite a good little mindset change. There are 2 particular parts of Beam that I'm going to borrow for Sunbeam, and those are the 3 Ds and the 7 Ws, and we're going to revisit exactly what those do a little bit later in the presentation. So, Sun modeling. I describe Sun modeling as a word-of-mouth technique. So whereas for Beam, I can point in the direction of Lawrence Core's book and get you to go read it, or Kimball method, I can point in the direction of the Data Warehouse Toolkit. Sun modeling, there's very little literature out there. Like, seemingly it's kind of passed on through generations of data professional to data professional. In terms of like how I learned about the technique, I've sort of listed a few advocates for Sun modeling here. So back at my very first SQL Bits, there's a lady called Emma Zambanini, who was a consultant at Coeo. I believe there's some Coeo people in the house, if they want a little cheer from the Coeo crowd. Okay. I don't believe she works there anymore, and I also believe that she's no longer called Emma Zambonini either, but she gave a talk at SQL Bits about some modeling. There was a chap called Pete Moore who was an independent data consultant around the Manchester area, which is up where near I live. Anyone heard of Pete Moore? Cool. Okay. So Pete came in. A company I was working at that time was we were a travel industry, and he came in and did a workshop with our development team around some modeling as well. And then anyone heard of Terry McCann? So, like, one of the few hits you will get if you scour the internet for information about some modeling is a online talk on YouTube that Terry did a few years back, lightning talk as part of one of the data relay events. Now, those three people actually all have something in common, and that is that this fellow, Mark Whithorn, who's a Professor of Analytics at the University of Dundee. So they all studied under Mark as part of doing that degree course, and it's basically a technique that Mark is credited as creating and something that he teaches to his students. Now, first off, if Mark were here and he were watching me give this presentation, he may well turn around and be like, Johnny, you've just done it all wrong. That's not how it's supposed to work. Me talking about being a bit of a word-of-mouth technique, and maybe there's been some Chinese whispers. Regardless of that, the inspiration has come from this. What I'm going to demonstrate to you is kind of my adaptation of it, and which works for my purposes. Now, when we talk about some modeling, we talk about the idea of a data model in three different types of concepts. And I want to stress that this is all about data models for analytics workloads. We're not talking about transactional systems or OLTP. So we talk about the user model, the physical model, and the logical model. So the user model is how your users interact with the data, and it's often represented as charts, graphs, and grids. Now, from a requirements gathering perspective, this can sometimes be quite a good starting point. If you worked on an analytics implementation and you're trying to understand what it is you want to implement, getting the users that are going to use the system at the end product, getting them to bring some existing reports along can quite often be useful. In terms of wanting to design a star schema, I can look at these examples and say, okay, I can see there's sales revenue by product category up in the top left. So I'm probably going to want to have a fact table with my sales revenue in. And I'm probably going to want to have some kind of product dimension that's got category descriptions. And I can see from the line chart on the right, sales unit quantity, it's probably going to want to go in my fact sales table as well. And that's going to be sliced by calendar year month. So I'm going to have some kind of time dimension. And then we've got the table down there with a few more dimensional attributes. So we're starting to get an idea of what the star schema might look like. But what you'll often find with these user models is they've got very small scope. They serve very specific use cases. And when it comes to designing a star schema, we want something that's going to be a bit more holistic and answer more questions and anticipate the kinds of analysis that our users are going to want to do. So this is a good starting point, potentially, for your requirements, but it's not going to necessarily go into the depth that we want. Now, the next concept is this idea of the physical model. So an example of that is something like a database ERD diagram. And this has got tons of detail in it. You know, we have got here all our tables, we've got our data types defined, we've got foreign key constraints, our primary keys, we've got some crow's foot notation, so we know about cardinality. This is really, really in-depth stuff. Do you think you could go into your business stakeholders or your customers and your clients when you're kicking off a data platform and just say to them, awesome, if you could just give me the ERD you'd like me to implement, that'd be great. Business people don't think about the data like this. You know, as a data professional, as a developer, if somebody gave you this as a blueprint, that would probably be fantastic for you. It's just not realistic. So we're looking for that, you know, a user model probably doesn't go into enough detail. A physical model goes into too much detail. We want that Goldilocks effect, that what's just right, somewhere in the middle, something that both those groups of people can work on and understand and find common ground on, okay? And that's where we get the logical model. So the logical model is kind of just giving you a high level, it's written in business language, it's sort of showing how the data is related, that kind of thing. And ultimately, the way that we create a logical model is by doing some modeling. So we want to combine these two things. We want to combine Beam and we want to combine some modeling to go through this process. And the way that we go about that is by facilitating a workshop, or perhaps a series of workshops, depending on the scope of the work. So we want to give some thought in terms of how we want to do the facilitation for that, right? So in the before times, like I guess the first few iterations of me going through this process, what I would do is I would get the business users that I want involved, and we'd all jump in a meeting room together with a whiteboard, and we'd sketch out some logical models and some concepts in terms of the star schema design that we wanted. Obviously, the world's changed, and it's sometimes a little bit more difficult to get all those people in a room. I work for now a fully remote company, so it's all about interaction online. So in terms of workshop facilitation, there are a few really good pieces of software that you can use, or online services. I've had a lot of success using Miro as an online virtual whiteboard. I'm not sponsored by any of these, by the way, no kickback. Go check them out. Mural's another good one. I've had some success using Mural too. Microsoft Whiteboard is rubbish, but most people are going to have it, and at a pinch you can get away with it. I've even seen people do it with just PowerPoint and Visio live as well, in terms of like that online interactive holding a whiteboarding session. So you've decided on the format for your workshop. Are you going to do it in person, get around some whiteboards, hash out some designs? Are you going to host it online using some kind of online whiteboarding technology? So then you need to decide who to invite. And the number one bullet point here is get your business users involved. This is all about collaboration. Who here has been involved in a project where IT have gone in and just basically done what they thought was right for the business? Yeah, me too, 100%. I've absolutely done that. We want those business users in there up front, understand what it was they want. It's their needs that we're wanting to satisfy in terms of what's going to get delivered as part of the project. So get those guys involved, or those folks involved. From the technical side, I'd say it's good to have at least 2 people running the workshop. Good to have a facilitator who's going to kind of run the sessions, drive the conversations and ask the questions, and then a scribe, somebody that can take the notes, possibly operate the whiteboard. So again, the before times when we could do this in a meeting room around a whiteboard, I actually used to hold these sessions, and I was quite happy doing them solo. I could talk and write on a whiteboard and design quite happily. And then you put me in an online scenario and you get me to try and talk to people as well as operate IT. I mean, you've seen me with my clicker. Yeah, talking and operating IT at the same time is just a recipe for disaster. So it's good to have 2 people that are going to effectively coordinate that workshop, so that one person can focus on driving the conversations and the other one can make the record of the workshop. So that's kind of going to be the format. What about in terms of almost an agenda? So from a Beam perspective, we talked about our 3Ds. And the 3Ds almost make the agenda or the format that the workshops are going to follow. So the 3Ds, they are discover an event, describe an event, and document an event. Discovering an event is about asking the question, who does what? Describe an event, we'll do using the 7 Ws, which I'll come on to on the next slide. And then we document the event. Now, for those people that are familiar with Beam, Beam has a whole host of documentation associated with it, and it's really, really thorough and in-depth. Go on, show of hands again. Who's actually gone through a full end-to-end Beam implementation? Okay, cool. So I would not say that I'm not a critic of that documentation. I think it's fantastic. But I've also come from a background of working in relatively small teams where you're dual hatting. I've worked in some big organizations with business analysts that manage the requirements. And sometimes I've found that producing and maintaining all that Beam documentation can almost become a full-time job on its own. So if you're working in a smaller team and you're trying to work in a bit more of an agile manner, using a Sun model as effectively the documentation for this requirements gathering process is just a little bit more lightweight and just, can get you up and running in terms of identifying those requirements a little bit quicker. So the first D, discover, which is all about asking who does what. And again, referring to the point I made earlier about the fact that this process has evolved and continues to iterate. When I first started doing this, we used to try and do the discover, describe, and document all in one workshop. And what we've found is working better these days is actually potentially have a workshop up front that discovers all of the events first, and then reconvene at a later date, potentially understand which audiences are going to be best to contribute to defining those events in a set of separate workshops. So the describe is all about asking the question, who does what? It's as simple as that. In terms of the example I'm going to work through today, because I spent a lot of time working for a retail organisation, that answers some of the question, who does what? I'm going to pretend that I'm modelling a sales process, and a very simple sales process as well. So the who does what will always have an actor and an action. The answer I'm going to give today is that my customer buys product. That's it. As simple as that. That's the discover part done. So from a business process perspective, a more complex business process might have multiple events. For the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to have one. For argument's sake, if this was some kind of bespoke online sales organization, you might have customer places order, you might have manufacturer produces order, and you might have courier ships order. There's 3 different processes in one sale. This is just going to be like a high street retail scenario. So customer buys product, like fits the bill for my entire process. So having discovered my event, and I want to describe my event. This slide is really pretentious. When I was at college, I was an English literature student. It's a little poem by Rudyard Kipling, The 6 Honest Serving Men. Yeah, I don't need to read it for you, but the names are what, where, and why. I can't even read it. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. There's only 6 W's there. So the 7 W's are actually who, what, when, where, why, how, and how many. Please have to forgive the fact that how and how many are slightly tenuous W's. There's a W in there. They don't quite start with W. That's what we're going to roll with. So in terms of describing our event, these are all the questions we want to ask. So customer buys products. So we want to know about the who, the what, when, where, why, how, and how many. That's what we're going to use to describe it. As we describe it, we're going to document it at the same time. And to do the documentation, as already mentioned, we are going to do a sum model. So this is a little sum modeling template that I have. And up the top, there's the event that we're going to describe, customer buys product. Down the left-hand side of the screen, we've got the 7 W's as a bit of an aide-memoire in terms of what those are. I switched up the order slightly, so my how many has gone to the top, because the how many is going to be the first question that I ask. So, first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to draw a big circle in the middle of my template. This is like the sun, that's why it's yellow. Apologies that is a bit basic. Inside of that, we're going to ask the how many. So when it comes to customized products, what are all of the how manys we can think of? What are the things we want to measure? What are those key KPIs that we're interested in? So, some examples for a sales process. We might want to know the revenue associated with the customer buying the product. What was the cost so that we can calculate our profit? Once we've got that information, we can look at calculating things like margin percentage, and we want to know things like volume in terms of unit quantities and order quantities. I've tended to find from doing these workshops that don't get too bogged down in trying to identify every single last how many. You can start with a good, decent half dozen is a really good place to get conversation started in terms of building out the rest of this conceptual star schema. And also, you can always look at add things at a later date. So don't let the business users get too bogged down in making sure they remember every single last thing. Once you've exhausted the how manys at the start of your workshop, ask your business users, your stakeholders, the people that have come along to the workshop, the who. And there's a really big clue for this, because when we did the discovery of our events, we asked the question, who does what? So the answer's already on the sheet. The customer buys the product. So in terms of our sum model, we're going to add an object for our customer. Now, there's a dot on the end of that spoke, which is there to signify the cardinality effectively. That dot is signifying that for each transaction of revenue or cost, there should be one customer. So the dot's all about the cardinality effectively. Once we've identified customer as the object in terms of our who, we don't stop there. Turn to the rest of the people taking part in the workshop. What else would you like to know about your customer? So perhaps they want to know customer name. Then ask them, well, what else would you like to know about your customer? Maybe they might want to know things like date of birth, so you maybe do some age analytics. Maybe you might want to know things like gender in terms of doing what sort of splits in terms of those kind of things. Maybe some other demographic type information. For the sake of demonstration and for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to give you a handful. But in real life, you'd step through this and you can continue to ask the question about the customer. What else would you like to know? What else would you like to know until you've exhausted it? A customer object can get pretty big because there's normally a lot of attributes that people want to be able to analyze by. So you carry on going until you feel you've exhausted it. Once you have exhausted it, we can ask the question what? And again, there's another big clue. Because we've already asked the question, who does what? Customer buys products, so the what is going to be the product. So we add the product onto our sum model as a new spoke. Again, we're talking one product per transaction or unit of revenue. So we've got the dot there to show the cardinality. And again, we don't stop there. What would you like to know about your product? So business users might want to be able to slice and dice those measures and KPIs by product code, or maybe product name or product description, maybe product category, so you can roll up groups of products and things like that. And again, don't stop there. You just carry on going until you've exhausted all the things about the product that the business users and the people in the workshop are going to want to know. Once we've done the what, we move on to the when. Now, pretty much every sum model design I've done ever always has some kind of object that you're going to want to slice by some kind of time series. So you can have some kind of date object in there. And modeling data in a sum model can have a little extra feature of this, I guess, and we're going to represent this a little bit differently in terms of the way we're going to represent this on the diagram. So if we talk about date objects, you might want to roll up those dates by month, and then you might want to roll them up by quarter, and then you might want to roll them up by year. And so what we've got there is we're building that hierarchy. So when we've looked at customer and product, off the back of identifying that object, we've drawn a series of spokes with all of the attributes that we want to be able to slice and dice by. When it comes to date, and we're looking at actually building out hierarchies, we represent that by building it out in a straight line, and that's basically represents what that hierarchy is. It's possible for any given object to have more than one hierarchy. So especially something like dates, there might be an alternative hierarchy there. So if you're talking about maybe a financial year with financial periods, 4, 5 weeks, that kind of thing, you know, you can have more than one hierarchy on a given object. Once we've covered the when, then we can move on to the where. So customer buys products, what are the wheres we might like to know about it? So a retail sales scenario, store location. Store location is another great example where we might want to use hierarchies so that you can roll up by cities or states or counties and countries and regions. In terms of that store object, also you can mix and match hierarchies and individual attributes. So it's not a case of one or the other in terms of the way you represent this on the diagram. Oh, I've got promotion on there too, double clicked. After you've identified the where, then we go for the why. So again, in terms of my sales example, why did the customer buy the product? They bought the product because it was on offer. So maybe that's my example of what I might capture for promotion, and maybe you want to know things like promotion code and promo description for something like that as well. And then once we've covered the why, we move on to the how. So again, customer buys product. How did the customer buy the product? And for my example, I've shown a payment type, and perhaps when we ask, what do you want to know about the payment type? Well, was it cash, card, finance, provider, that kind of thing. And once you've worked your way through all those questions, you have a finished sum model. Now, I once sort of went through this process with somebody, it was a business user, and they said to me at the end of it, oh, it's like a mind map for your data, which I thought was like a really, really nice way to put it. It's, you know, it's designed to try and be relatively high level, relatively straightforward. It's in business language. Hopefully a business user can look at this and they're understanding the story it's trying to tell in terms of, you know, these are the things that you want to be able to measure. These are the things that we're going to be able to slice and dice this by in terms of doing that kind of analysis. If I put my developer hat on, I have got a straw man star schema. That effectively, top level, conceptually, is what a star schema looks like. How many is in the middle is a fact table. Our objects are on the outside of our dimensions, and then all of the attributes we've associated with those objects are the dimensional attributes that are going to go into that star schema. So we've gone through a process there. We've got the business users involved. We've got the business users describe their data in their terms. We've collaboratively designed a star schema. Now, I have a few tips and advice about walking through this. Ask the 7 Ws multiple times. Again, in terms of demonstration and brevity, I've literally asked the question once and I've moved on and I've given you an example of each one of the Ws right there. In real life, there's often more than one answer. So, like classically the who, and we said the customer's the who, but in a sales organization, the answer to who might also be customer buys products, what the who's we need to know about it, who sold it, who's the salesperson. So if that were the case, you would create another spoke with another answer to the question of who, that is salesperson, and then you step through that, say, right, well, what do you need to know about your salesperson? You might want to know the salesperson's name, the department they worked in, all that kind of information as well. So, yeah, ask them more than once. I tend to do one at a time, so I tend to do the who's, exhaust all my who's before I then move on to my what's. At the same time, when I talk about asking the 7 Ws many times, sometimes there won't be an answer to the 7 Ws. So particularly the why and the how are a little bit abstract. I've quite often asked that question to business users, and they can't think of an answer. And that's absolutely fine. We're not necessarily here to tick boxes in terms of making sure that we get something for each of those, you know, each of those questions that we're asking. It's all more about provoking conversation and getting those business users to think about it and get those cogs grinding in terms of drawing out those requirements from them. I absolutely recommend just having one Sun model per event. So again, from the basic process that I've demonstrated today, my sales process had literally one event in it. If your process has got multiple events in it, I'd recommend doing a multiple Sun models and do one Sun model per event. What you'll quite find if you start trying to mix and match separate events into one Sun model, they'll be at different granularities and really shouldn't really exist on the same fact tables. You know, we're talking about, yeah, keep them separate and do one at a time. And what that can mean is that you might want to have multiple workshops. So you, like for a given process, you might have certain people that have like particular knowledge of that process that are the best people to get in a room. And then the next event, in the process is different people. So it's worthwhile having different workshops to get different perspectives on it. So don't be afraid to hold multiple workshops for multiple events. The other thing in terms of that, doing it as separate Sun models, and the other thing that I'd encourage, I guess, is to try and do it one business process at a time. It's not about trying to boil the ocean and design your entire enterprise data platform in one Sun modeling workshop. It's about having that almost narrow scope to start with and iterate and build out from there. Another thing I like to do is do this before my data discovery. So if you have worked in data and you go in and you want to build some reports and you start fidgeting about in somebody's ERP system and you're getting an idea for how the data is stored and how its data is structured, I think sometimes that can influence your thinking in terms of preconceptions about how you think that star schema is going to look. So for me, almost doing this before you've had a look at what the customer's data even looks like is really, really effective. You're going in there and looking at it, and unbiased and not having any preconceptions about what the star schema ought to look at like, just because you've already seen an ERD that had a sales table and a product table. So approach it, be a bit more open-minded from that perspective. And at the same time, don't get too bogged down in terms of what you already know about the data. So I always give a silly example for this. If you can imagine you were holding this workshop and you were doing your customer object, and one of the business stakeholders says, what I'd really like to know about my customer is their eye colour. Because I want to know if people with blue eyes or brown eyes buy more fridges. And you know full well that the business systems that capture this information, that's not going to have eye colour in it. Be open-minded, capture it as a requirement anyway. What's quite a useful thing to do after the event is almost use this conceptual model as like a gap analysis. So you can actually feed that back to your business system teams and iterate and potentially drive requirements from those transactional systems to facilitate better analysis in the future. So eye colour, okay, probably a bit of a silly example, but just be open-minded in terms of those requirements and try and cater the workshop around the business user's needs as opposed to what you think you already know about how the data is going to be stored and structured. You might want to use the Sun model and the logical model that you've constructed to go away and design a physical model. So again, I've worked in teams where we'd do these workshops and we'd have a set of Sun models. And we'd hand that off to the technical team and they were more than happy to take that Sun model and just build it based on that. It was like, yep, conceptually, actually, I understand that, and I'll go away and build it. I've also worked in organisations where they wanted a little bit more certainty about the design. So actually, they've gone through a stage of taking that conceptual model and actually converting it into that logical model and actually going through the, right, now that we've identified these objects, let's actually figure out what our data types need to be, and let's more rigidly define things like our cardinality and our relationships and things like that. So you might want to do that as well. I would always say that this shouldn't be the blueprint, this shouldn't be the fixed design. This shouldn't be the, right, we've had a requirements workshop, we did a conceptual model, we've handed that off to the development team. That's not like signing a contract to say, right, we'll go away and deliver it, because things will always happen throughout the development that stop that from happening. Come across scenarios where, again, I guess going back to that silly eye colour example, some of the data might not necessarily exist, so your design is going to change over time because of that. There's also elements in terms of once you have got the kind of conceptual design, but they're then doing your data discovery, you find out that potentially, actually, we've got these two concepts on my Sun model, and then it turns out that in terms of the way the data's stored, it's actually the same thing. And even though the business users thinks it was two different things, we're just going to consolidate that and denormalize further in terms of the star schema design. And then lastly, if you do have multiple Sun models, you can consolidate those models into a bus matrix. People familiar with the bus matrix from Kimball? Yeah, cool. So just an example from the Kimball workbooks, basically about an example bus matrix. It's a really, really useful way to take multiple Sun models and understand the commonality against them. And that can also help you to prioritize the workload in terms of a project, because you can see potentially which tables and dimensions might give you the most value early in terms of getting up and running for how you want to structure the project and do the delivery. I've harped on about this project, this process, and as I say, it's something that I've worked on over a period of time, and yeah, I'm probably a little bit proud of it. I'm not going to say that it is perfect though. So in terms of when we're capturing that Sun model as a document, we're assuming one-to-many relationships anywhere, so we're not covering things like, that simple skeleton star schema type design. We've not covered things like many-to-many relationships. We might need things like bridge tables introducing. So it doesn't cover things like that. It doesn't cover things like dimension types. I've not talked at any point here about, is your customer slowly changing dimension? Do we need to capture whether or not their address changes over time, or it's just a snapshot? It doesn't. That process didn't ask that question at any point. Now, on the one hand, as I continue to iterate in terms of the process, I've been having discussions and trying to think about ways we might look to bake that in. The flip side of that is that I've never yet come a cropper from not asking those questions. It kind of flushes itself out in terms of the implementation. Because brought your business users into the process early, and you can sort of build those relationships and continue to have those conversations, those kind of detail in terms of things like slowly changing dimensions or like cardinality discussions have always just come out through the implementation. So it might be a gap that is worthwhile addressing, but also something that doesn't, hasn't hindered me yet. My last takeaway from this is that you should make this your own. So I've talked about there the fact that effectively I've taken inspiration from a couple of other techniques that I've come across through my career, and I've adapted them and adjusted them, and I've cherry-picked the bits that I liked and turned it into a process that has worked well for me. So I've run through these types of workshops in 3 or 4 different organisations now. I'm probably well into double figures in terms of hosting these types of workshops, and this process has worked well for me, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it works well for you. So by all means, if you like the example that I've stepped through and how this works, and you want to copy that verbatim, go for it. But riff on it yourselves. If there's parts of this that you thought, actually, I'd never thought about it in that way, I'm gonna nick that. But that other bit, that was rubbish. I'm not interested in it. Make this your own. Don't have to necessarily do it the way I've done it. But by all accounts, if you like that, and if you want to go give it a try, go knock yourselves out. Thank you. That's the end of the session. Has anybody got any questions? Apart from, no.
What's the answer?
It depends. For the people watching, there's a question about Spark clusters, which this presentation wasn't about. Anybody else for any more? Yep.
Pass you the box.
Yeah. During your workshops, do you stop and ask the customers what do you mean by certain terms that they are saying, just to clarify what's the terminology is?
I want to say yes. I would like. Sorry, just for people want the question repeated. Do we ask questions to clarify further? Do we ask what do you mean by? Yeah, absolutely. So what's quite common in this, especially if you hold multiple workshops with different groups of people, is you end up with people having the same terminology for different things and then different terminology for the same things. And I guess for me, this is all about that collaborative aspect and like building those relationships with people, and that kind of through the rapport you build through that, you end up, you do end up diving into those things a bit more. Sometimes it might escape you. Like you come to the implementation and you realise that somebody wants the job number and the WBS code. So we've got a job number on. I was BAE, I was manufacturing background. We've some model that's got a job number and it's got a WBS code on it, and then all of a sudden it transpires, oh, that's actually the same thing. And that comes back to that sort of, this doesn't have to be the fixed, this doesn't have to be the fixed design, and be prepared for there to be some flexibility. Obviously, if somebody says something and you don't really understand it, yeah, absolutely ask further questions. But then at the same time, I guess sometimes as the development team trying to understand the business context, you might miss stuff, but that is what it is. Anybody else? I'm going to, by all means, if anyone's got more questions, feel free to ask. I'll stick the feedback code up there in the meantime. Ooh, okay. So question, what are your thoughts on other beam techniques such as modeling by example and prototyping? Which bit don't work for me and why? I don't think it's that, no, I don't think that for me it's that, I don't think there's any part of beam that doesn't work for me, other than the fact that it's a long process. You're going to have to put a lot of commitment and time to go into things at that level of depth. So if you've got the luxury of the time and the headcount to be able to go full beam, I definitely wouldn't advise against it. I guess almost this idea is kind of that sort of quick start, get yourselves up and running from a conceptual perspective and go from there. Any more? How am I doing for time, Andy? Everyone just wants to go get ready for the party, I reckon. So everyone should just go do that. I don't know who's going to be here for the rest of the weekend. I'm going to be at the party tonight. I hope you all are going to be as well. I am going to be on the stand for the rest of the week as well. Anyone's got any more questions, please do feel free to reach out, and I'll happily answer anything I can in person as well. But otherwise, enjoy your Friday.